Hi, my name is Janet Dalecki. Welcome to the live stream. I'm going to talk a little bit about fusing today, some basic fusing techniques. And I'm going to start by running through some basic glass cutting skills. So I'd like to show you some glass cutting tools. And here we have some basic cutting tools. We have the pencil style cutter. This cutter you can hold straight up and down. You can put it in between your fingers. I started out using one of these, but I discovered the pistol grip cutter. This is a little bit more comfortable, and it's a great tool for cutting with when you may not have enough strength in your wrist and you just want to be a little bit more comfortable. It's got a nice grip to it. We've got some other tools here that are good for aiding in breaking the glass, trimming the glass, and I think the best way to talk about them is just to cut some glass. So here at the studio, we use Bullseye glass. Bullseye is the brand of glass. It has a coefficient of 90. That's the COE, and that's really important because glass needs to be compatible in order to survive going through the kiln process. So I'm going to go ahead and use my pistol grip cutter to cut the glass. Now, the blade, there's actually not a blade, but it's more of a wheel that's used to cut the glass. If you looked at the wheel really closely, it actually comes to an angle there, and it's just this little wheel that actually scores the glass. So it's a little bit like a pizza cutter, but just on a really small scale. And you always want to stand up or just have a lot of good leverage when you're cutting. So always start by putting the cutting wheel just a little bit onto your glass. Hold it at a 45-degree angle from the table. Press down pretty hard, and you want to hear a nice, crisp zipping noise. I don't know if you can see that white line there, but basically that tells me that I have a good score. I could put a thumb on either side of the score line, and I'm going to break in expansion. You never break in compression, so I just pretty easily can break that right apart. Now, I like to break the glass with my fingers. It's comfortable and it's easy. If you have a good score, it should be no problem. I'm going to cut this one in half. Now, if I were to break this, you can see where the glass is actually very close, the edge is very close to my thumb. So if I go ahead and break that, it probably won't be too much of a problem, but I run the risk of cutting myself. So I'm going to grab my running pliers. And the way you know, we have a little mark right on the top of our pliers here at the studio. That line on the pliers itself lines up with the score mark that I made, and you can just give it a gentle squeeze, and it breaks the glass for me. When you look at the tool, you can see it's got that same curvature that my thumbs made when I broke the glass apart, that expansion. So those are my running pliers. Now, if I were to cut this piece in half, quite a rather skinny piece, sometimes it might be too skinny to get a good amount of leverage with the running pliers. So you can opt to use some grozing pliers. These are actually combination pliers. We've got breaking pliers, and these are grozing pliers. Either one would actually work. Now, if the piece is really narrow, I could probably put a thumb, but again, I run into that issue where the edge of the glass could could cut my thumb. So instead, I'll use 2 pairs of grozing combination pliers, and I'll just, again, in expansion, break that piece apart. Now, if I had a piece and I wanted to just trim off the corner, for example, say I made a cut and it just didn't go quite as the way that I wanted to, I would choose my grozing pliers. And you see here, if you look carefully, there's a row of little teeth lining the inside of the pliers. That's great for simply grinding away, you can, if you notice here, I had a corner there and I just was able to get rid of it if I wanted to round the glass, for example. It's good if you have a little burr or a little sharp edge that may have broken at an angle and you just need to trim it off. A lot of times if you've done stained glass and you're used to working with a grinder, it's easy to say, oh, I'll grind it, but then you run the risk of really using that grinder as a crutch. Better to get really good, really skilled at cutting, and also just using your grazing pliers to quickly remove any little sharp bits. So the breaking pliers do a lot of what the grazing pliers do. And then we also have the wheel nippers, one of my favorite tools. If you do a lot of mosaics, I love mosaics as well. This is a great tool just to trim glass really rather quickly without having to get out your cutter. I mean, it's still a hand tool, but it's one thing that you can just quickly nip off a bunch of little pieces. If you don't need the piece to be super cut super accurately, if you just need to trim something, it makes a relatively straight line. It's basically two, think of the wheel on this enlarged. And then when you put two of them together, you more or less put the center of the piece you're cutting right in between those two wheels, squeeze, and it just nips off in a rather straight line the glass very quickly and easily. Great tool. I love the wheel nipper. Okay. So if you were to be cutting circles, a lot of times you can find a couple different styles of circle cutters. You can also cut a circle by hand, so that's easy enough. Here's one version of a circle cutter. Again, we basically have the same cutting head on the end of the circle cutter, and it's got a little bit of a suction cup here to just hold right in place, and then the cutter will swivel around to make the cut. I've got a small cutter here for making very small circles. So I'll demonstrate how to use the small one. And I've got a clear piece of glass here. What you would do is place your glass under the circle cutter. Make sure as you go around that you have plenty of space. I'd give yourself about ½ an inch or so that you can make sure the cutter is not going to go off the edge of the glass. And I like to make sure also, very important, that you're not going to get in your own way. You don't want to have the arm of the cutter run into your hand. You don't want to move at all because then you're going to ruin the placement of the glass. So again, you want to hear that crisp, crisp zip. And one thing I should mention too that I forgot to say before, you don't want to go, like a pizza cutter, you'd go back and forth maybe. You don't want to do that with a glass cutter. You'd risk ruining the head of the glass cutter. So one-time cut, you don't want to overlap on your circle. So make sure you know where you started and then you can end there. You can turn your glass over and just give it a little press and just kind of help that cut along. Sometimes you can see the cut actually run by putting a little bit of pressure there. Whoops. And what I'll do, I'd like to work on a piece of paper because anytime any little chips come off, I can simply use the paper to discard those chips without having to sweep them up or clean them up. So I'll use my, my cutter to make some relief lines. I always start at the circle and then make a cut from the circle out. Then I don't run the risk of cutting into my circle. So I'm making relief lines to let that cut release the circle from the glass. So I have I've got a relief line here. Oops. Sometimes the glass is going to break wherever it wants to, so you have to just go with it. And I'm using my running pliers just to coax that line around the circle. And of course, if you get any little burrs, you can see there's just a couple of little burrs there, little triangular pieces. I can go ahead and easily take them right off. If they're big enough, you can actually pull them off. And then you've got a nice circle. Yeah, one thing, it's very tempting to want to sweep the glass with your hand, and you'll learn very quickly, if you do glass at all, that that is not a good idea. So I'm always aware of our Band-Aid area. We've got a station here at this studio for any nicks and cuts. Okay, I'm going to make my way over here. And I'm going to talk about basically the next tool we have is just a strip cutter. So we had a circle cutter, and now we have a strip cutter. This is the same thing. We've got the same cutting wheel. Again, it comes to that point. It's made out of tungsten, sometimes carbide, and these are really great little cutting heads. This time, in the strip cutting case, it's affixed to a little arm here. And we've got a cutting board that the cutter is designed to run along. I don't know if you can see this. So we can have, an adjustment right here, and I can go ahead and adjust whatever the width is, and I can cut strips of glass off of sheets of glass. The reason I'm going to be using this tool today is because I'm going to be using the strips of glass to make stripes, stripes. So I'm going to be using a style of pattern making today in my fusing technique to create different styles of patterns. So I'm going to be using Murrini. If any of you are familiar with glass blowing, a lot of times you'll see Murrini making as a very popular form of pattern making in glass blowing. So we can also make Murrini in the fusing room. So here's a pattern bar. So we basically take a bunch of strips of glass, colored glass, stack them up, fuse them all together, and then I get this bar. It's basically like a loaf. And then once I slice that loaf into, think of it as bread, take those little slices of bread and turn them sideways, I'll get a pattern in cross section. It's really easy to understand with the stripes because it's just pretty visually obvious. So here's one that's already been completed, but I'll show you how we get those stripes by just cutting a strip off of this piece of sheet glass. Here at the studio, we have a beautiful array of glass right behind me here. You've got to be really careful when you handle these sheets because sometimes they have some very sharp edges. When the glass is manufactured, it's rolled, and sometimes air bubbles form here because the glass has been kind of folded over on itself, and these edges can be really sharp. So whenever I handle these sheets of glass, I'm really careful not to put it right up against my hand. I kind of leave a little bit of space. And also, one side of the glass tends to be more flat than the other side. So there tends to be a kind of a rough rolled area, and you always want to try to cut on the smoother end. Now, of course, you always want to be safe. Put your safety glasses on. Also, another thing, it's tempting when you have a home studio to just kind of be casual. I love flip-flops, but I always wear closed-toed shoes when I'm in the studio because it really can be very dangerous when shards get into your shoe or when they fly. I've even had shards kind of fly even behind the safety glasses, so you have to be really careful. You want to protect, of course, your eyes. You only get two. Okay, so I got my strip cutter. Just going to grab this oil here. Whenever you cut glass, Whenever I'm fusing glass, I try not to use the cutting oil if I don't have to, because it's just something that I'm going to have to clean off. But it is a good idea to oil the cutting wheel. So I'll try to use just a little bit, and I run the head of the glass cutter through a little puddle of the oil. And I'm just going to cut a 1-inch strip. I've got a ruler here, and I'll set my measurement to 1 inch. Okay, I've got a nice transparent green color. So I start from the top. I've got my glass pulled all the way into the corner so it's not moving around on me. And then I'm going to pull down. And again, you should get that nice crisp zip. And be careful when you're picking up the sheet. If you have a really, really long sheet, you can use 2 pairs of the running pliers, 1 at either end, to help the break release cleanly. I'm just going to use my thumb at one end and my tool at the other end, and then I get a nice strip of glass. Now, if you were making a bunch of pieces that were all the same size, which is what I'm doing right now, what I would do, I have the luxury of having 2 strip cutters. So what I'm going to do is set one at 1 inch, which is the width of the strip, and then I would set the other one to 8 inches, which happens to be the measurement of my pattern bar dams in my kiln. And you can see that breaks super easily, and I end up with a 1 by 8 inch piece of glass. Now, once I get a bunch of those all cut up, all the colors that I've selected, I end up with this nice stack of colored strips of glass to make a striped pattern bar. Oh, that's a mouthful. Okay. So I'll take this, and I'm going to come on over here. So I've got a little mock-up of what the inside of the kiln looks like. And so rather than take you over to the kiln, I'm just going to show you here that this is basically how I'm going to load my, my glass pattern bars into the kiln. So I've got some pattern bar dams, or basically ceramic shelves, ceramic shelving material that has been cut up into these dams. They've been kiln washed, so we put a form of release agent on the ceramic surface. And that's to make sure that the glass doesn't stick to that surface. If we didn't put that release agent there, we would never get the glass back out successfully. So I've basically created parking spaces by lining up these pattern bar dams, and the gap there is 1 by 8. The best way to make a bunch of pattern bars is to make a gang mold. So I've created a parking lot, basically, and I'm just going to park my glass right into the parking spot. Make sure I get my fingers are a little dusty. So I've got my pattern bar here, and to really make the most use of the kiln, I'm going to make a bunch at once. And then I can simply put 1 dam right across the front. When I crank up the temperature on these, the glass has nowhere to go. It's going to melt, it's going to solidify, it's going to turn into a nice solid block of glass with the pattern in the middle there. But if I didn't have these dams, they would just flow out, because that glass would be so thick, it would have nowhere to go but out once it was molten. So the dams keep everything nice and square, nice and tight, keep it in that loaf shape. So I just want to show you quickly while I'm here that I've also gone ahead and created a couple more pattern bars, and I've done them with some different designs inside. So it's easy for me to think of stripes, but when you start thinking of different designs in cross-section and how to cut them, it can be a little tricky. So let me show you what this one, let's see, that one will turn into, this one will turn into basically this. It's like a window that has a frame around it. We We've got ones that have clear in the middle, and then a frame, and then a frame around that. So that's basically what I've created here. And this one, I've actually created a void. I've left a void so that once this melts, the glass is going to settle down, and it'll actually create a little bit of a wave in between. And we don't want to get rid of the volume, so I've stacked it up on top here. So I have removed what was down in here and placed it up on top. And when that comes out, it should be some stripes with like a divot. So that's just an example of making different kinds of pattern using the same technique by stacking up different sizes and pieces of glass and creating those pattern bars. So this is ready for the kiln. Okay, I'm going to take you over here and we'll talk a little bit about using those pattern bar slices, which we call Murrini. So I'm going to swivel around. Okay. So now we'll pretend that my pattern bar came out of the kiln, it's cooled properly, it's all the way down to room temperature, and I would take this into the cold working studio, and the first thing I would do is slice up my bar. So we'd put it on the tile saw. It's a wet saw with a diamond blade. And once we get that going, I have a little jig set up in there so that every time I cut a slice, I can just move it over. It'll hit the jig every time so that I'm cutting the same exact thickness. And of course, I want to cut these pieces as thin as I can so that I'll get the most amount of slices from one bar. So over here, I have a couple of different just piles of some Murrini. Here's what one slice would look like. This is a little bit on the thicker side because it's an end piece. You know how the end is never quite the same on the loaf of bread as the regular pieces of bread. And if I just take squares, and of course they look a little bit dull when they are dry, but once they fire, they're going to shine back up, and you can see how vibrant they become. So imagine these just a little more vibrant once they fire. So I could take these squares and I can just arrange a pattern, and I could come up with a pattern like this. And I have some examples around here. We go, right in front of me. This would be something you would get from arranging the squares, just alternating them sideways and vertically. But then you could also take one of the slices and use your pistol grip cutter and just simply cut, because basically the thickness of my slice is approximately the thickness of a sheet of glass. And just by using my my trusty running pliers and my pistol grip, I can cut my stripe pattern bar into 2 triangles. So we get 2 triangles, and you might wonder, like, well, okay, what can you do with that? And it turns out when you flip them around, you can start to get a whole wide range of patterns just by simply using the striped pattern bar. So I have a couple of examples here. Just by augmenting and turning those triangles, you can get this pattern here. You can actually have it be like a crenellated pattern that keeps going, and it actually creates a circle. This is just the tip of the iceberg of what you can do with these triangles. So just to further talk about that, a great place to go for inspiration for pattern making, surprisingly, is a quilting book. Or maybe not surprisingly, if any of you quilt, you can see just how quickly something really basic and simple like a stripe, when you start to cut it into a triangle and start to, maybe you add pieces of glass running through, you can really start to change that pattern into something really impressive. So this came from a yard sale, I believe, and it's a great way to get inspiration and ideas for patterns. So I just wanted to point that out because, man, you know, just by sitting here and playing with things, I can't think of things, you know, until I see them. It really helps to have the ability to just augment these back and forth and really get a lot of variety. Okay, also talking about the striped pattern bar, I've got these pieces here. So these were just a striped bar. And it's just a pink and kind of ruby color. And I've cut them rather thick, very chunky. You can see the width. So versus when you compare it to one of the ones that I cut before, I've left this one intentionally much thicker. So if we just find those images that I've sent over, we'll pull up some images to show you what you could do with that. So here I have the pattern bar on the tile saw that I was talking about before. And that's where I cut them up, leave them really thick. And then next image, here I've measured out the Murrini, and I've accounted for the actual the weight and flow calculations for bullseye glass, the specific gravity. And then I've calculated out a specific amount of grams of glass for the 5-inch by 5-inch space. And I've placed those Murrini, and then if we advance to the third slide and we turn up the heat really hot and hold it there, those pieces will actually flow into each other, and they'll actually create a kind of a skewed little version of those stripes. So it's a really neat way of using the striped pattern bar again, and having those stripes kind of wiggle and melt together and flow and kind of run into each other to make a really neat, unique new pattern out of those basic stripes. Okay, coming back over here, I've got just on this piece of paper right here, I just sat down. I took a piece of graph paper because it's pretty easy to draw squares and lines and everything when you've already got the graph paper there for you. And I just started by brainstorming with just some couple of ideas of how to make pattern bars. Started with the stripes. I got into like some slightly more complex patterns. You can see over here, this was my window Murrini and the window with the frame around it. Here I have a regular striped pattern bar. I cut all the pieces in half and then I just rotated them. So there's just, I mean, again, this was just me sitting down for a little while, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. You could get probably tons, I wish I had an actual number, but infinite different types of configurations of different patterns, different styles, and when you add in that quilting effect and all the things you can do, there's so many different patterns that you can create by making pattern bars. I've got a couple of examples here just to look at, and basically I wanted to draw your attention to this. When you look at this dish, just an interesting little aspect, you might think that this was the pattern bar. I don't know if you can see that, with a white swirl in the, kind of pinwheel in the middle. But in fact, when you look on the edge, this is the pattern bar. It's got a black cross in the middle. So one thing to consider is that when you arrange all of your pieces together, you might get the pattern you think you're going to get might be overpowered by something else. So sometimes you can. So that's where I can think one way, but until I arrange it, I don't always see the alternate pattern that kind of emerges. So it's so much fun to play with Murrini. And coming over here, I've got some examples of just different things that I've done with triangles and the patterns that you can get. Again, these were all started as just a basic striped pattern bar. One thing to consider, I have this one out as an example of using transparent colors. I've fused the transparent Murrini onto a white background, but it still reads very dark. So when you're making your pattern bar, you want to consider the colors that you're selecting, and are they going to be bright enough? Especially if you put your dish or whatever you make on a table, on a dark surface. You want to make sure that you have nice bright colors that are going to really pop. Another way to make pattern bars that are kind of like a quick and easy thing, you don't need the dams or any of that, basically take a pile of scrap glass, little whatever you have lying around. You make a lot of scrap if you have a studio with sheet glass. It's inevitable. Make a pile, just put it in the kiln, nothing on it, a couple of layers high, melt it, and then just cut off a strip. That's what I've done here. And then when you turn it in cross section, you can get kind of a little skinny Murrini right there. When I fuse that together, I end up with my pattern here. Just a random design, but it's just another way of thinking of how to use your scraps and to also use it in order to make a pattern. Okay, so speaking of scraps, you can create a dam and just fill it with scraps and still get that loafed shape, still get a nice bar. And you slice off, your Murrini, and you might come up with something kind of random like that. But it's still square, so you're able to tessellate it and arrange it in a way that's very geometrical. Okay, what else do we have? Oh, sometimes you want to make your Murrini in different shapes, your pattern bars in different shapes. So you can, of course, use a mold to make your pattern bars triangular. So right here, I don't want to move that too much. I've got some iron, some angle iron there, and I've lined it with some pattern bar dams, and I was able to make a long loaf of triangular pattern bar. And then when I cut that up, I was able to get this pattern here. And I've got these slices that can be arranged however you want. So, you're not limited to a square, and you're also not limited to 1 by 1 by 8. That's what I picked because that's the size of the pattern bar dams that I have. But if you have a kiln and if you have dams, and if you have a tile saw especially, you can make your pattern bars whatever size you want. They could be rectangular, they could be triangular. You can use even some thick fiber blanket and start to get into round shapes. So there's really infinite possibilities of what you can do as far as design. Now with this triangular piece, I tried to make more of a controlled design, but for this one, right here, this green piece, I was able to just basically line the inside of my mold with some light blue and then green, and then the rest I just filled in randomly. So I actually like that better than the one that I tried to be so precise about. So again, just an example of whenever you think you have the answer, a lot of times you really don't know until you see the outcome. So that's what makes this process so exciting, because when things start to unfold and you have lots of pieces, you accrue all the pieces to work with and you lay them out, the patterns start to just emerge, and it's things that you never thought you would come across. Okay, I'll try to make some space here. So another thing we talked about briefly is the scrap bars, where we kind of just load scraps that you might have into the kiln. But you can also do sort of something in between, where I've created a bar. I have intentional colors selected. I've got some voids, so I know there's going to be a little bit of wiggle room. And then I placed a rod. Actually, it's the same thing you would use in the flame working studio, a round rod of the bullseye glass right down the center. And that gave me kind of a polka dot that it kind of smushed a little bit. But anyway, sometimes I call this, sometimes fuser friends and I have called it bacon bars because they kind of look like bacon in cross section. They're not quite a free-for-all, but they're not exactly planned down to the T, so they kind of have a little bit of movement to them. So bacon bars are fun, and when you cut your, of course when I'm finished making this was you can see it's bigger than the 1 by 1 by 8, so it was a wider loaf of glass, more similar to this. And I cut off some slabs of bacon. And so I get a little bit of movement here, a little bit of a wiggle, and it just has a little bit more of a organic kind of feel to it. So talking about that brings me to my final style of pattern bar making. And I just call these swirl bars because basically, rather than having my standard pattern bar dam mold, I'm going to take the mold and put 2 steel bars. I don't know if you can see this right here, but 2 steel bars are going to run through the parking space of my pattern bar parking space. Yeah, 2 bars run right through. And instead of putting the glass inside, I'm going to put the glass up on top. So I stack 14 layers of glass up on top. They rest right on top of those steel bars. And then I crank the temperature up in the kiln to about 1550 degrees Fahrenheit, and I hold it there for an hour. When I close the door of that kiln, it's a little scary because you see all the glass balancing and then we're turning the temperature way up so that it's going to start getting hot enough to just start dripping. So that glass does exactly that. It drips, it softens, and the bars basically cut right through as it's dripping down and stir the glass. So you end up getting this design. So you'll get a loaf at the end. It's inside of this. So then when you open, you fire the glass, you open the door, and your glass, instead of being perched up on top here, has now dripped through and is inside of the parking space. Hopefully, that's if nothing fell over. And knock on wood, haven't had anything happen yet. But it does make a bit of a mess. But you get a loaf of glass, and cutting it in cross section reveals these beautiful swirls. So I've got a couple of examples here. And one thing you can do, and I've left this one intact, is you cut the bar and you leave them in order. So cut them, cut one slice, put it down, cut the next slice, put it right next to, right after the first one, put them in succession. And that way, when you take the first 2 and you open them up, they actually will fit together. They'll bookmark, they'll match, like they'll butt up against each other and create a nice pattern that fits. So that's how you would get something like this. And you can see that the pattern kind of connects to itself. And another thought or idea is that you can take your loaf of glass and instead of cutting it crosswise, you could cut lengthwise. And it would just give you a totally different look. I tend to think that cutting it cross-section is actually a little bit more exciting, but this is just a different, kind of like a wood grain look, but you definitely will get a different style. And here's an example of this one. I had cut this one in cross-section to get this, but here's what would have come out if I had cut it all in length down the side. So just an example of different ways of cutting your pattern bars and what comes of it. Now, here's another one. One last thing A fun thing to do with your Murrini, besides creating a flat dish, is that you can cut off slices, rather thick slices. So here I've got one. Give a little nod to the Pride Month. We've got some rainbow Murrini here. Got a nice slab here. And what you can do is build a mold in your kiln using pattern bar dams, and you can actually create a three-dimensional piece. So here I've created a box. Still have to make a lid for it. But that came from this bar. I've tried doing them round, which is also fun, even though it's a little bit more challenging because, of course, you're dealing with straight pieces. So you have to really crank up the heat to let everything settle and try to melt into those voids, or just plan on your piece being faceted. And that's another way of just changing and augmenting your plan. So when we make these pieces, you can notice that everything I have here is more or less three-dimensional. So the first step is making your pattern bar. Second step would be cutting up your pattern bar slices into Murrini. Your third step would be to arrange your pieces all together. And the kiln is going to fuse all of those pieces flat. So you have to fuse them. We call that a full fuse when we take all of our pieces, melt them together into one smooth, nice flat piece of glass. And then that will get cooled down, taken out of the kiln. And then we place that on a mold, and then it gets slumped, where it actually takes the form of a mold, or in this case, to make like a dish shape. And so it has to go through the whole series of steps. So unfortunately, you can't take your Murrini and just put it in the mold, because there are different temperatures that the glass has to go to. When you slump the glass, it has to be at a much lower temperature than full fusing the glass. Unfortunately, you have to go through the full fuse first, and then you have to go through the slump second. So I've taken a bunch of my slices, and I actually used these, and I've put them in the kiln this morning. And so my pattern, I'll just show you while it's cold, my pattern looks something like this. And in a minute, we're just going to go right across the hall to our kiln room, where we keep all of our kilns. And I have a piece in there that's a little bit larger than this, but you get the idea. This is the pattern that is in the kiln right now. So I turned on the kiln at approximately 9 o'clock, and I've programmed it to come up to 1490 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's going to hold there for about 15 minutes. And everything is going to just melt together and get nice and smooth. So let's go check out the kiln and see where it's at. Hopefully we can open the door and take a peek. Okay, so it looks like the kiln's at around 1100 degrees. We'll take a quick peek. It's pretty hot. And it's kind of already done a lot of melting. It's still forming together. But there you have that pattern I was talking about. And I'm going to close the kiln now just to make sure it retains its heat. So whenever we put our glass in the kiln, I had mentioned that we're going to put the shelf primer on anything that we want to put glass on. So when that piece comes out of the kiln, it'll be a nice flat sheet, and I'll take a mold and paint on a little bit of the shelf primer. So again, that will act as a releasing agent so that the glass will not stick to the mold. So once that glass comes all the way down to room temperature, that'll take approximately 24 hours total, sometimes a little bit less. Usually it feels like it should be less, but then the last couple of hours are like, oh, you're just dying to open the kiln. And it's just those last couple hundred degrees that take forever. So you have to earn it. You really have to wait for your piece. But we'll end up putting the glass setting it on top of the mold. And then I would reprogram the kiln so that it's going to come up to only about 1290 Fahrenheit, just about 1300 degrees. So then the glass will actually take the shape of the form, and when you're all finished and you have to wait again for it to come out of the kiln, you'll get your final piece. And so your final piece will have taken this shape of that mold, and it's a three-dimensional form. So there you have it.